Hello Year 8. Today we're going to continue our look at the transatlantic slave trade and the British Empire. Today's lesson is called How Did Britain Benefit from the Slave Trade? By the word benefit, I mean how did Britain as a nation gain from the slave trade? Maybe economically, in particular in terms of how its wealth was generated. The first thing I want you to do is to look at these four images that are on the screen. And think, how are these images linked to the slave trade? What connects them to the enslavement and in some cases murder of African people in British colonies in the Caribbean? Okay, so all these images on the screen show ways in which Britain as a nation benefited from the slave trade. It's no exaggeration to say that the slave trade is one of the most shameful incidences in British history, and that Britain as a nation benefited vastly from the enslavement and, in some cases, as I mentioned, murder and killing of millions of African people who were enslaved on British colonies. For example, here we see a country mansion built by a slave owner within Britain on the wealth that he generated in his sugar plantations. Here we see the Old Vic Theatre in Bristol, one of the country's oldest theatres, which was invested in by slave owners and slave traders. Here we see images of different banks that still exist today: HSBC, RBS, Barclays and Lloyds. The banking industry benefited massively from the slave trade. Indeed, the Bank of England itself was partly funded by the wealth generated in the slave trade. And here we see images from the textile industry, in particular cotton industry, which, if you think back to our work on the Industrial Revolution, was Britain's most important industry during the 18th and 19th centuries. And that textile, that cotton, was picked by enslaved labour. So the work of slaves had the effect of not just making people who made textiles rich in Britain, but also providing jobs for people within Britain. So as a nation, Britain benefited, sadly, from the slave trade. And we're going to explore that in a bit more detail in this lesson. So starting off, if you look at our first task, what I'd like you to do is to read the article which is attached to the Show My Homework posting on how did Britain benefit from the slave trade. I want you to read the article carefully. It's got 2 pages. As you read it, I want you to highlight or underline information about these 4 or 5 different factors. First, underline or highlight examples of groups or individuals who benefited from the slave trade. Highlight or underline facts that show Britain benefited economically, by which I mean grew wealthier because of the slave trade, or perhaps enabled it to buy goods for a lower price because of the slave trade. Industries that benefited, so examples of industries might be textiles industries or the banking industries, where jobs were created in Britain because of the slave trade. The goods, the products that were brought to Britain that people could purchase, for example sugar, and the new jobs that were created as a result of the slave trade. As you read through the article, please make sure you highlight or underline information about each of those 5 factors. So pause the video and spend 10 minutes doing that task now. Okay, now having read the article, I want you to use that information to complete our second task, you're going to draw a mind map showing how Britain benefited from the slave trade. I've got the example of the mind map here on the screen. The first thing I'd like you to do is to draw a circle, or oblong as I've done here, and write in the middle of it, how did Britain benefit from the transatlantic slave trade? Okay, now you've done that, I would like you to use the information that you highlighted in the article to add to your mind map. I've given you some examples of the sort of things you might like to add here. So for instance, I've written ports in cities such as Bristol and Liverpool expanded. The places where the ships were docked expanded massively, creating jobs and wealth for those cities. Also, new products such as sugar and tobacco were cheaper for ordinary people because they were produced by enslaved people, so therefore they cost less to buy. New jobs were created in industries such as textiles as well. All these are examples of how Britain benefited from the transatlantic slave trade. I would like you to add at least 4, but there are many more points that you can add to your own mind map. So pause the video and complete that task now. To do this properly, it should take at least 10 minutes. Okay, so our final task today is a writing task. And we're going to answer this question. Which group of people do you think benefited from the transatlantic slave trade the most? And I want you to explain your opinion using evidence, quotes from your article, your mind map. What I've given you here is some sentence starters that you might wish to use. And the most important thing when we're doing any kind of writing in history is to use this format: point, evidence, and explanation. Make a point, use some evidence to back it up, then explain that evidence. So you might like to use this structure. Many people in Britain benefited from the slave trade. For example, you would insert some group of people who benefit from the slave trade and some evidence to prove that. Then explain your point. This means that. In addition, again, another group that benefited from the slave trade. What evidence do you have? This means that. The people who benefited most from the slave trade were. Here I want you to come to a conclusion as to which group you think benefited the most. Was it the slave owners, the plantation owners, the banking industry, the textile industry, the ordinary people of Britain itself? Who benefited the most from the slave trade? And make sure you explain your point using this most important historical word, because. Once you've finished that task, there is a challenge task to undertake as well. Why do you think it took the British government so long to get rid of the slave trade? The slave trade operated for approximately 300 years within Britain, capturing people from Africa, transporting them in horrific conditions across the Atlantic, where they were forced to work in conditions so bad that many of them died, for cheap goods to be produced back to Britain. People knew that the slave trade was horrific, that these conditions were terrible, and yet the slave trade persisted for hundreds of years, making Britain the richest country on earth. Why, given what was known about the slave trade, did the British government take so long to get rid of it? So I hope you do attempt to answer that challenge question. Pause now and complete the writing task. It should take at least 15 minutes to do properly. Okay, thank you very much, Year 8. As always, please submit your work via Show My Homework or via email, and contact us via those two options as well. Thank you.